Okay, well, welcome to this most latest episode of the Akkad and Coca Report. Today we are wonderfully lucky and grateful to have Dr. Janssens giving us her time here on a weekend. Dr. Janssens is a research professor of translational epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology at the Rollins School of Public Health, Emory University in Atlanta. Her research concerns translation of genomics research to applications in clinical and public health practice, and she works a lot in how and she studies how the predictive ability and utility of genetic testing. So I thought this was super important because we at the moment, at least it seems there's been an uptick for the last 2 years. Suddenly we're awash in all this prediction data, and there's certainly a push from certain quarters to start using genomic, the data we can get from studying genomes, from population genomes, and put it into clinical practice. And Dr. Janssens is going to put some speed bumps into this whole process. So, I kind of first it kind of first got on my radar with a paper by Amit Kara and the Dr. Kathiresan, Sekar Kathiresan, their group that came out in Nature a little bit ago, talking about polygenic risk scores, and they went through. They used polygenic risk scores. They used to come up with a risk prediction of for various different diseases. There are 5 diseases. One of them was cardiovascular disease, other was diabetes. And basically they were able to group people based on polygenic risk scores into, high, medium, and low risk, and have suggested that we should use these scores and use use what they're predicting to perhaps screen better or perhaps even inform therapy. Can you talk to us a little bit, Dr. Janssens, about the background of that paper and how they kind of went about doing this?
Of course, I cannot look in their minds on how they came up with this paper. Let me start first on how I got surprised by the paper.
Okay,
because
great.
I've been working on this field this year already for 15 years. I started in 2004 with a very critical letter to the editor to a paper that Moeen Khoury from Atlanta had written in the American Journal of Human Genetics. He was the first in 2003 to create a polygenic risk score. And his polygenic risk score had only 5 DNA variants. At that time, we didn't call them SNPs, so it was just genes, very, very broadly. And so he concluded, based on a very optimistic scenario, that the future was very bright for polygenic risk research. And my colleagues and I in the Netherlands, we wrote a letter to the editor illustrating to this group that, that if you combine several variants together into a risk model, that you should not look only at the tail of the distribution, the few people who get a really high risk, because that's with every risk model, there's always a few who are the most unlucky, but that you should look at the entire distribution, and that you should use metrics like the area under the curve or the C-statistic to look at the entire distribution. And so at that point, of course, Moeen Khoury was not really happy with our letter, but it started off a very, very fruitful collaboration. So already early, around 2004, 5, 6, we did a lot of simulation studies on how predictive can polygenic risk scores become if you start combining hundreds of variants into a model. And so we modeled, that's the advantage of simulation data. You never run out of power. You can simulate whatever you want. So we created polygenic risk scores from a few variants to hundreds of variants. We varied the effect size of each of the variants. And basically what we modeled is that if the effect sizes get a little bit small, at least, in our most pessimistic scenario on those days in 2006 was way more optimistic than we see today, the scores don't get really very predictive. So when the group of Sekar Kathiresan came up with this paper last year and all the empirical studies in between, we were always wondering whether there would come a first study that would debunk our initial calculations that we did on simulation study. So every time that there comes a study that says, it's very predictive, I am already, alerted, like, okay, were we wrong, or is this paper wrong?
So tell me,
yeah.
But so tell me about how did you? Well, first, can you explain what a polygenic risk score is in the best terms that you're able to?
Well, a polygenic risk score is, we calculate them for diseases or traits where there's not one single gene that predisposes you getting the disease or getting the trait, but when there is multiple susceptibility variants. So it is many variants. Can be in the beginning it was tens of variants, now it's hundreds of variants, and maybe thousands of variants. And what Kira et al. Published was millions of variants. When you combine, they are thought to represent the genetic susceptibility to those common diseases. And as a way to quantify this genetic susceptibility, people combine them into a score. They combine them into a score in the same way as you combine your cardiovascular risk factors into the Framingham risk score. We do the same thing. The only difference is that all the SNPs that go into such a score, they come only in three different genotypes. You get 0, 1, or 2 risk alleles from both of your parents. So it is not that you put age and blood pressure in the model, which have their own distribution, but all the variants are 0, 1, 2, and they have here in this model usually very tiny effect on the risk of disease.
So you have these large numbers of patients now, or people now. Sorry, that not everyone is a patient.
No, not
that
yet.
have been sequenced, and basically you have folks that have disease and folks that don't have disease, correct?
Yeah.
And now the common way these days of analyzing their DNA is not by necessarily comparing the whole gene sequenced versus another gene sequence because it's too hard. They use something called SNPs. SNPs is single nucleotide polymorphisms, correct?
Yep.
And basically, it's the most common variation that you can find between populations, between individuals. When you compare two DNA sequences, basically, it's where one single base pair of our 4 original base pair model differs, correct? And so you get this, you're able to map on basically on your chromosome from 0 to 23, etc. Frequencies of basically you can map SNPs and how they differ across that entire DNA sequence, correct?
Well, you map them. So if you're thinking about the Manhattan plots, how they do it in the Genomewide association study, you basically compare for each single SNP separately whether a certain allele, that means a certain state of that polymorphism, is more common among patients than among controls. And so when a risk allele, when an allele is one of the alleles is more common among patients, we call that a risk allele, and that is the allele that increases the likelihood of getting the disease. If you would prospectively genotype that allele in a new population.
Can you? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Can you tell us a little bit about the databases? I mean, those population databases.
Yeah.
What are they? Are they common? I mean, do all researchers work on the same databases and analyze the same ones, or are there different ones? And how is the clinical data gathered?
So these days we see that many researchers use the very large databases such as the UK Biobank, but which has 500,000 UK participants. But there are many cohorts and other large data sets across the globe that in which the patients of the people in those studies have been genotyped. They either have been, I think it's mostly Genomewide association studies. So these people have been genotyped, for example, for 500,000 markers, 500,000 SNPs across the genome, or 1 million or 2 million. And so what these researchers do in their population is to see whether, so when you have the UK Biobank, for example, you have in the UK Biobank, you can have people with type 2 diabetes and without type 2 diabetes, or with coronary heart disease or without the disease. And you can, for each of the SNPs that have been genotypes, you can see whether one allele is more common among patients than not. But if you do that for 500,000 or 1 million or 2 million SNPs, then you will always find something. You know, you do it just too often. So there's a lot of, you know, a lot of SNPs. Often a lot of risk alleles will be found more among certain patients and among controls. And that is why you always in genome-wide association studies have additional populations where the ones that you identified in the first population, you test them in an independent population to see which ones replicate.
Right, but I was also wondering about the clinical endpoint. So all these individual genomes have associated with them some ICD-10 codes or ICD-9 codes, or something like that that have been scraped off clinical databases, presumably, or
right. So that's actually one of the issues I was going to raise was that for instance in Dr. Kara and Kathiresan's paper. In which they looked at these five different disease processes, one of them being coronary disease, for instance. How do you define coronary disease? Because what you need to do is define a population of healthy, a control population that doesn't have whatever disease you're looking at, and one that has it. And the way they defined CAD was by either you had to have a revascularization, or at some point you had an ICD-10 code that corresponded to coronary disease. And as Michelle and I know very well, you can get diagnosed with coronary disease for all sorts of reasons. There's if you go to a cardiologist who does a lot of calcium scans, as Michelle does, you know, there's a 70% chance you'll walk out diagnosed with coronary disease. And certainly, if you have, if you're revascularized, if you have a stent placed, right? Certainly in the last 10, 15 years, you know, having a stent, whether you have a stent placed or not, doesn't necessarily identify you as somebody that, that may not be a clinical endpoint that matters so much, because we do know that there's a lot of folks that get stented, you know, for reasons that may not be the greatest ones. Meaning, the more you look, the more you look for disease, the more you find, and once you find it, then you're kind of stuck in terms of doing something. And we know from autopsy studies from a long time ago that, you know, a large percentage of people die with their coronary disease, don't die of their coronary disease. So, you know, it gets to this very important point, meaning what is this? What is this validation part here? That's what you were alluding to, right, Michelle?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And also, just more generally, maybe you can, you know, as an epidemiologist, you can tell us. You know, coronary disease, we think of it, I mean, if we look at it historically, we had an episode, you know, way back last year from a historian who looked at, you know, coronary disease as a pandemic, you know, a historical pandemic. And so, you know, presumably in situations like that, you think that the genetic factors, you know, I mean, it may increases somebody's susceptibility, but it's not necessarily causative in any direct way. And so I mean, is that what we're trying to find, is just the susceptibility of people to getting coronary disease? But
that's why I thought, just if you bear with me, Michelle, on this one. Okay. And I know this is not what Dr. Kara and Dr. Kathiresan did, but you know, just this Manhattan plot that's here that comes up a lot. You know, it's named so because it kind of looks like the skylight of Manhattan. The key here is that each dot here, going from chromosome, you know, looking through all the chromosomes here, each dot represents the likelihood that there's a significant difference in terms of allele or SNP frequency. Is that right, Dr.?
Yeah. And that every dot is a SNP, and so every time when you see like a tower in the skyline, it is you know, you have several SNPs that are very close to each other, and that's of course what you you know, I always explain it to students like barbecuing in the backyard. If you barbecue in the backyard, then it smells like barbecue in your own garden, but also in the neighbor's garden. And so that's why you see many dots elevated. You see the effect a little bit also in the neighboring SNPs, and so that's what we're seeing here. It does not mean that the highest is the causal SNP. We have no clue.
Right.
But there is a region on the DNA in that region that there might be something of interest. That is what genome-wide association studies reveal.
Right. So the key here is the y-axis represents a p-value, right?
Oh, yes.
And,
yes.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. So no, you're so far advanced. So these things are basic for you. But the key is that the key is that the y-axis is p-values, and the p-values represent. And so the height, these dots that are up here, the purple or black or what have you, those represent SNPs that are very, very different for the disease process being looked at, correct?
Yeah.
So if you have So on chromosome 6 here on the towards the end as you're getting into chromosome 7, for some reason these SNPs that are located here, there was a highly significant difference seen, at least highly statistically significant difference seen between those who are those who are diseased and those who are dictated as or regarded as not diseased, right? So, so these SNPs are basically these SNPs are correlated with, possibly correlated with these disease, but don't say anything about the causal nature of any of this stuff.
No. And then when you go back to the early days of genome-wide association study, the idea behind this was suddenly an enormous luxury. Before the GWAS, researchers were also looking for genes that were implicated in diseases, but they could only look at one gene at a time and a few markers at a time. And then suddenly came this new technology that would allow for looking at 500,000 markers across the whole genome.
Right.
But still, the idea was, to get hints of biological pathways.
Right.
So that was the hint. And so when the goal is just to find hints, and you're not interested in really the effect sizes on how much is this increase, you just want to see where on the genome should we look more, our next phase of research, where should we go more deeper? Then you can put the people with coronary heart disease. I'm not sure whether I'm not a cardiologist, so I may lose my credibility in your field immediately. But then you can combine all kind of sort of related phenotypes together. It doesn't matter so exactly whether all the doctors diagnosed everyone on the very same way. When it's approximately right in a large data set, you are likely to find such hints if they are worth following up. Right. That was the early days. That was the early day behind it, and so. But after that, many researchers did not go. When the Framingham did it in their cohort, everyone got genotyped. I'm from the Netherlands, where we had the Rotterdam study. Everyone got genotyped, and we all did this genome-wide association studies. But after that, we started pooling it in bigger studies and pooling it in even bigger studies, and now pooling it in studies that have 500,000 or 1 million participants easily, rather than, of course, some people went on to do more detailed research to follow up the initial signs, but many people went to larger and larger GWASs. So what you get with larger and larger GWASs is that's simply how power of a study works. With the same level of genome-wide significance, you find smaller and smaller effects. And that is what we are seeing. So when you look at the first GWAS actually had only 150 people in it. It was in age-related macular degeneration. And I do not know exactly, I can't remember exactly whether they had 50 patients and 90 controls or vice versa. But the effects of the polymorphisms that they were expected to find in macular degeneration were so large. Each allele was giving 3- or 4-fold risks of disease. And, here for coronary artery disease, we are happy when it's 1.1. But if you are expecting a large effect, you need a small study to find that effect. And of course, you need to replicate it. But by making all these genome-wide association studies larger and larger, we end up finding more smaller and smaller and smaller effects.
Right. So where each little SNP high frequency, p-value, significant p-value, the p is 10 to the 6th or whatever, but because but you're only finding these tiny p-values because sure, no problem.
Yeah. Sorry.
because you have so many patients. So interestingly, big data has made genome-wide association studies statistically significant.
That is what you get. But here is then, if we are going to make this bridge to prediction in a minute, for prediction, the effect size matters. We make prediction models based on the effect size. So we are not interested so much in the statistical significance because most of the variants that Kira included in their score are not statistically significant on their own.
Right.
They dropped the part, yeah.
So today, clinical risk prediction that me and Michelle use relies on age, gender, ethnicity, body mass, smoking status, alcohol, physical exercise, all these things. Some environment comes into play, family history, of course. But of course, there's this the big kind of I don't know about elephant or mouse, depending on what you're saying. In the room is the genetic inheritance of common diseases, and that has to do with heritability, correct? The proportion of phenotypic variation in a population that can be explained by genetic variation, right? And that's the controversial thing that we're kind of trying to talk about today. A good example that's brought up a lot is the BRCA genes, right? The BRCA1, BRCA2 genes. Now the prevalence of these genes is much less than 1%. And at a population,
the mutation in those genes, because we all have the genes.
Oh yeah, sorry, exactly. The mutations at the high risk mutations.
The mutations are rare,
yeah. The prevalence is significantly less than 1%. At a population level, breast cancer, the breast cancer contributed by BRCA is relatively low. It's only about 5% of all breast causes. Yet pathogenic BRCA1, BRCA2 genes confers a very high risk, estimated 65% or 45% absolute lifetime risk of developing breast cancer. And that's in contrast to the general population of women, where it's a 12% absolute lifetime risk in the general population. So is that an example, Dr. Janssens, of BRCA1, BRCA2? Just so I can, giving a real world kind of comparison example.
Yeah.
Is that the type?
Yeah.
Is that because this is not BRCA1, BRCA2? You would not talk about as it's not monogenic like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell or whatnot, right? Where this is.
Yeah, I do not know exactly where the clinical geneticist puts the thresholds. So when I teach about this topic, and I always start with the monogenic diseases where I discuss Huntington, cystic fibrosis. But I must say that I always consider the familial cancers in that group as well. It is not a 0% risk of disease when you don't carry the mutation and 100% when you do carry the mutation, but it is population-based risk or a very high risk. And the risk difference between carrying and not carrying the mutation is so high that it's just worth identifying the people with a mutation or a proxy of that, namely family history, in the populations, and to give them a more intensive surveillance program, or maybe even surgery if they test positive for the mutation.
Right. But
I think they fall in the work field of the clinical geneticist. So I think that is and the polygenic risk they also shy away from so far.
Right. So as time has gone on and we've had these larger and larger studies, you have more and more of these loci that are found. It seems to, are you saying, at least the claims made by folks is that, there's 80 loci that explain about, that explain about 20% of coronary artery disease is heritable. Do you think is that kind of fictional, or is that real? Meaning, have we actually, as we've expanded the net in terms of how many people we're able to study, are we truly finding that more and more of, say, coronary disease is truly heritable?
I find that a very difficult question to ask, because I would ask a cardiovascular geneticist about that, because for two reasons. First of all, is heritability is not a stable characteristic of a trait. It's not a stable feature. The heritability of disease really depends on in which population you are investigating it. So if you see heritability estimates for diseases in the literature, they vary all over the board. And so you have diseases that are highly heritable, like Alzheimer's disease or schizophrenia. Also, eye color is in that game. Then you have diseases that have a heritability around 40–50%, that are a little bit in the middle. And then you have diseases on the lower end, like type 2 diabetes, the non-familial breast cancer, It is very difficult. I find it very difficult to answer. Like, I do not know what the heritability of a cardiovascular disease is. You have all kind of definitions of cardiovascular disease. You introduced it already. And to say that we have already explained an X% of that genetic variability, we are getting somewhere. There are definitely many variants that have been replicated in many studies, but how far we are, I cannot say that.
So, so one of the other reasons it seems like, so initially when GWAS came out, it kind of landed with a little bit of a thud in terms of clinical predictability, right? Because there was such a, you were saying relative risk of 1.1 or something like that.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting shifting the goalposts in terms of how to evaluate GWAS studies has been that people have started to say that, the best way to evaluate this is not using area under the curve. Area under the curve is probably best understood as a diagnostic. It's best used for a diagnostic test to define, quantify probability that the predicted risk of an individual with disease is higher than the predicted risk of an individual without disease. So, in our world, we understand that this is where positive predictive value, negative predictive value, sensitivity, specificity have their interplay, and so. And we use that all the time in terms of trying to figure out if a test is positive, is the patient disease positive? And it is, and we use it all the time in diagnostic tests. Here, so do you think that is that an appropriate tool to kind of test, the polygenic risk scores?
Well, I'm a very big fan of the AUC. But it's not the only tool. It's also not the tool that ultimately matters. And so the polygenic risks of the AUC is really nothing more that if you would make a risk distribution, just like a histogram, and you make that risk distribution separately for patients and for non-patients, for patients and controls, then you see two risk distributions that have some degree of overlap. The area under the curve is nothing more than how separated are those two curves. I have a paper that's almost coming out where we show step by step how you get from these risk distributions to the area under the curve by just 4 simple transformations. So it is exactly the same thing. So it applies to diagnostic testing, but also predictive testing. Just you have the two risk distributions and how much are they separated. But being able to separate those risk distributions, you can do that by any risk tool, by any risk model. That is not the goal from polygenic risk research. What the goal is ultimately clinical utility in practice. Oh yeah, here you see one. Oh, you see now a risk distribution in the paper from Kira, figure 2A. Right. There you see the overall risk distribution. If they had projected that risk distribution separately for the patients in their study and the people without the disease, then you would see 2 overlapping risk distributions, and the separation between those risk distributions, that is exactly the area under the curve.
Right.
But that is not the goal. The goal is not to get as high as possible area under the curve. It's also not the goal to get it a touch higher than a clinical risk score. The goal of prediction is clinical utility, and so for that you need different metrics than the area under the curve. But at the same time, when the area under the curve and the AUC is very small, it's unlikely that you can expect clinical utility. And I'm very pragmatic in that respect. I always look for clinical risk models for the same disease and see what kind of AUC do they have, and use that as a kind of a benchmark on how the area under the curve of a polygenic risk score needs to be, at least to be competitive with clinical risk models.
So what about the idea that, and this is another, this is from something written by Torkmani and the Topol group, talking about why AUC may be not the best way of evaluating these studies, because they don't talk about absolute risks.
That's true.
So if it's the case that PRS is giving us, the polygenic risk scores are giving us subpopulations that have a higher absolute risk of disease than a low risk or a control group, then what's the problem? Why shouldn't we be using that? This.
Yeah, so the area under the curve, I think what is a bit difficult to because people say often say it doesn't generate, it doesn't look at the absolute risk, but the area under the curve is a measure for the metric, for it is a kind of a quantification of how good is the risk model. So you don't communicate AUC with a patient. You don't communicate it with a doctor. It is more like a tool for policymakers or people who write the protocols on which test to use in which situation. They need to know the area under the curve of a risk model to decide whether it is predictive enough to use in practice. And once you use it in practice, you don't need the AUC at all. It's like all the metrics. So when you use a thermometer to measure the temperature, you don't want there must be quality measures that say whether it's a good thermometer or not. But we never use those indicators. Right. But for the people who compare thermometers, they need to know which one works better than another.
Right. So tell me, this is again for. Can you? So what's the major problem? Would you say in terms of why these are not ready for clinical use?
So I see several problems. If you follow my comments that I usually make in the field, I mostly focus on the methodology.
Right.
So what I care most is some people think that I'm totally against polygenic risk scores, but I feel that it's the same as being against logistic regression or being against Bayes' theorem, which to me makes no sense. So I'm not against polygenic risk scores, but I'm really in very favor of studying it in the right way. And so we must not forget that prediction research, when we start thinking about how well a model predicts disease, prediction is an applied science. So we don't do prediction research to find out just the predictability of a risk model. No, we have certain risk factors that we consider based from the epi literature that we have, the epidemiology literature. And then we would like to see whether all these risk factors that we have are, when we combine them into a score, whether it's a clinical score or a polygenic risk score, whether they can predict a disease. But you have to understand that when you investigate the predictive ability, the same score may have total different predictive ability in whichever population you apply it, because it's sensitive. It really depends on who are the people in your population. And therefore, it's very important that we apply and evaluate those risk scores in populations, what we call for the intended use. In whom are you going to apply that model later? And so, because really the predictive ability, in my early days, when I think back in 2008, we evaluated a polygenic risk score for type 2 diabetes in a population that was 70 years on average, 70 at baseline. So if you think about the prevention of type 2 diabetes, is a 70-year-old population your target population that you think, if I'm thinking about a polygenic risk score, I'm going to apply that in a population that is at least 70 years old? No, you don't. You want to prevent that in younger ages. But the fact that we found that it didn't predict in older ages does say nothing about whether it will predict in younger ages. So you really should be, that should be your starting point. Which medical decision or which public health program needs a better prediction? And for whom is that program? And that should be your study population in which you want to investigate the predictive ability of a tool. And then you can start, then you know your target population, you know what you want to predict, you know which predictors are available in that population, and then you start thinking, investigating how well a polygenic risk score predicts.
I see. So you're raising the issue that, well, one of the issues that, the UK Biobank, which is where, so for instance, this paper was based on the UK Biobank study. It's primarily a European ancestry, and of course they're volunteers, correct? So obviously
they're volunteers. But also their age range is anywhere from, I thought, 35 till 70.
Right.
And so every model that you construct in the UK Biobank has a very strong predictor, namely age, for every disease that is age related. And so when you look in terms of the AUC, and I can always immediately see whether a prediction model is evaluated by an epidemiologist or a statistician, because by someone with experience in prediction, because the epidemiologists easily say that the risk model was adjusted for age. But we know that if you adjust for age, that age is in your model. And if you then see a high C statistic, then that C statistic is likely high because of age. And that was also one of the issues in the paper of Kira et al. They had in the preprint on bioRxiv, they had a substantially lower area under the curve than in the ultimate paper in Nature or Nature Genetics. And the difference was age. So I think the area under the curve was differed somewhere from 0.65 in the preprint to 0.80 in the final paper, and that difference was contributed by age. So I think when you want to use the UK Biobank for prediction, first of all you need to be extremely careful. There is a paper, the PIs of the UK Biobank wrote a paper themselves that you should not use the UK Biobank for risk research, not for incidence prevalence estimates, because it's selected, it's biased, you should not do it. And what you see a lot, and that I don't understand that, is then people use the UK Biobank for risk research, and then in the limitations in the discussion you read, they write that it's not suitable for this type of research. And I think you can really save your time and do it in another population, because we cannot generalize the predictability of a polygenic risk score. You know, the ones that we have found in 70-year-olds, 18-SNP did not predict diabetes in 70-year-olds, does not tell anything whether it will predict in a clinically relevant population of younger adults. And that is all the time. So if you want to use the UK Biobank, I think the first thing you can do is zoom in the age range. Only consider maybe now and then I need to talk with a cardiologist, because I do not know in which age group you want to prevent cardiovascular disease, but not maybe in the very young and maybe earlier than 70.
I see. So would you? I mean, so if I'm interested in, for purely selfish reasons, a 40-year-old man's risk of having a heart attack in the future is at least the genetic components of it. You would say the UK Biobank. You would say only filter out, do a study only among 40 to 45-year-olds.
Yeah, for example, and then you will find, so then a lot of risk factors, of course, there's way less variation. And then you will find out that it's way more difficult in such a limited population, so of a limited age range and a healthier group, way more difficult to predict cardiovascular.
I see.
Right, Dr. Janssen, I really.
Yeah,
I really appreciate your cautious stance here, and I think you point out, very correctly that statistical analysis, at least right now, is not ready to have any immediate clinical utility.
No,
but I'm wondering about even long term. What is your view about the role of genetic epidemiology in the clinical arena? Because essentially, I mean, it seems to me that the problem is inherent to the field. That if you're gonna need to read the tea leaves of statistical analysis, then inherently it's going to be, you're going to find things that are, where the effect size is too small to be clinically meaningful on an individual basis when you're confronting with one patient, a doctor seeing a patient. So who are the genetic epidemiologists, working for, essentially? I mean, you mentioned policy and that sort of thing. I mean, it's, how do you see that playing out, in the future, or I mean, I can understand that there's, there's a scientific, there's a knowledge aspect to things. We can find associations, and that has, some appeal in and of itself. But I wonder if it will ever have any direct clinical relevance. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it will have clinical relevance for some diseases in some situations. So if you think about age-related macular degeneration, they know several variants plus a ton of others, that together, because of the strong effects that a few of the polymorphisms have on disease risk, you can construct a polygenic risk score that's quite predictive. The same is for other autoimmune diseases, for type 1 diabetes, for maybe a little bit even for Alzheimer's disease. But you need a few variants that have a stronger impact on disease risk. So
well, but even then, clinically, even then, don't you're gonna be screening anyways people for macular degeneration. I mean, irrespective of, because the score is never going to be 100% predictive. So at some point, either you decide to screen and look at the eye and decide if the patient has macular degeneration or not, or you don't. And
well, a clinical utility depends all what can you do with the information. And so if there's nothing you can do with the information because you don't have a preventive treatment, then the information just stays there and being unused. But I can see for if the variants have a stronger effect on disease risk, and it is for diseases where even more intensive surveillance, like for breast cancer, that's for certain groups of the populations at the much higher risk, you screen them a little bit more frequently to see whether they develop early symptoms.
Yeah, Michelle. Right. I mean, Michelle, we use the BRCA genes for to decide on, if you have a family history, personal, first degree relative,
FH, and there are several, and I think also that's how you should also look at the future of polygenic risk. There are exceptions. But so what worries me on some days more than on others is the enormous enthusiasm for the delta area under the curve of 0.01. That it's really a touch higher even in a study. And then I think, if you go into the wild with this polygenic risk score and clinical practice is very messy, this little tiny improvement that you have in your prediction is easily nothing in practice.
Well, so they show this here. They show this graph on the left. This is your slide, by the way, from Twitter. And this chart that they're showing here with percentile of polygenic score in terms of the match. So what's wrong? Again, me and Michelle have already outlined in the beginning the fact that all CAD is not the same. AFib here, for instance, was like self-reported AFib. There's plenty of patients that live very long lives with AFib. There are plenty of patients that have AFib once, never have it again. But anyway, so there's all sorts of issues related to that. But let's accept the fact that you could predict clinically important CAD and clinically important AFib. What's wrong with this chart here? Here they're showing that there are folks at the higher end of the polygenic risk score that are at significantly higher risk. They're saying threefold risk, and they use threefold risk because they said that the FH patients, right? FH patients are at threefold risk than the general population of having a clinically important endpoint. So what's wrong with this graph here, or in your mind?
So what's with this one? So the first thing what we miss if we think about prediction is what we call the prediction intervals, the uncertainty around the prediction. When I see a graph like this, I see most people in the middle, between 2 and say 4 or 5% probability of coronary artery disease. So the y-axis is zoomed in very much. There's a very small group that has a higher risk, this 12% risk. But how certain are we that that's a 12% risk? We don't see the uncertainty around these estimates. And that's for me, it's one thing. If you then comes to the clinical utility, of course. What are you going to do with these people? You should not forget that people even in the highest group have a 90% probability of not getting that disease. 90. That to me, if you want to use this information to motivate people, it's a hard thing to do.
Right, yeah.
Correct. And then how often do we would we miss this high risk, or how often could we also get it just through the family history? How much does it add if we identify the very, very high risk by polygenic risk score? Do we know how that compares to just a family history?
I don't know that they did it. They did not do a very honest comparison in this paper between the clinical model and the polygenic risk model. It was a bit of a pity. They did not have a clinical model that calculated the risk for each individual based on clinical risk and the demographics and family history, and then compare that with the model based on polygenic risk. So that is what we don't know either. But so what I miss in the graph like this, and that is I'm going to check that out with my statistical colleagues, why we don't discuss the prediction interval much more in prediction. Prediction interval is if you're going to use a prediction model on new people, it's not only the uncertainty around prediction is not only the confidence interval, but because there comes more uncertainty into a prediction. And if you want to use it for individual decision making, it's a different level of precision than when you want to make a threshold somewhere and you don't care so much whether people are in the top 1% or the top 10% because you are going to do more intensive surveillance anyway with the top 20%.
Right.
You know what I mean? So then it doesn't. So then doesn't matter whether you are in the highest bullet or one lower. You know, that may be messy, but all these people are above a threshold. So it really depends for prediction as well how accurate, how well it should be, whether you are going to use it for groups based on that you are you have your framing and risk score and you have certain thresholds for treatment, and the only thing that you're interested in is someone above the threshold or below, and you don't care so much how much below or how much above. That is a different level of predictability than when you want to say, no, really, your risk is 12%, not 11.
Right. So what if they went back? So, I mean, again, the way these studies are done is that there's obviously they look backward to see who is at high risk first, right?
Yeah.
Based on, and they come up with the polygenic risk scores and they say, aha, okay, these folks are highest risk at this polygenic risk score. Then once they have their polygenic risk scores, then they have a testing cohort, right? And or validation.
And they apply it in that, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
And that's how they generated this graph where they said, all right, we're now prospectively kind of looking at it, and using the score, we find that we're able to discriminate. What if they've also done stuff where, and you're of course one of the points that you raised that I thought was that's on the slide that you raised nicely was that the reason they said these folks are higher risk is because the 8 people, the upper 8 dots is the average risk.
Yeah.
8%, this 8 here is 8% is the average risk of the upper 8 dots. It's not that all of the 8 dots are at.
No. There's only one dot that was above it. So they say in the table that 8% is above. Yeah. The threshold, but simply, if in yellow, you could see that they ran a lot of logistic regression models to get to that 8%. To get to the, it's also not that the proportion was at higher than threefold risk. No, it is at threefold risk. It was 8% was at threefold risk, but it's only when you really look at how many were at threefold risk, it was only 1%. And that is in this paper, and so. The reason why I spoke up a little bit after this paper is a little bit out of frustration, because we've done this type of research already for 15 years. And this is just not the way how we look at it. And it's just also not the way that brings the field forward. And I find that a pity. This is just not the way how to analyze it. So my interest in speaking up about polygenic risk research is just the focus on the methodology. So we don't get polygenic risk scores any closer to practice if we keep on studying it in the wrong way. And it does not mean that we all have to study it how I say it needs to be studied. There is decades of experience in clinical risk modeling and also in polygenic risk modeling, where people have outlined and done a lot of research, especially in the clinical modeling, on how we evaluate those tests. And one of the things is, don't look at the top 1% or 10% or 5%. You can always find a top X% that has a Y-fold increase in risk. But you have to look at which threshold is clinically relevant. You cannot just pick and choose one that gives, an odds ratio.
I see. Right. So LDLs, for instance, the reason that makes sense to choose the top people with an LDL over 250, which is very bad, is because it is very, very rare for somebody with an LDL over 250 not to go on to develop coronary disease, and that's significant. Whereas if you just had some random distribution of, say, people with 6 fingers or 6 pinkies, and you just took the top percentage of those, that's not necessarily clinically relevant. And you're saying that these guys are doing something, these folks are doing something that's very similar to that, just kind of arbitrarily taking the top off.
Taking a cut, so it's also not only them, unfortunately, many other groups as well. It's not that they take an LDL level and say, if you are above that, you should you go to your doctor and do something. No, it is the top 1% of people with an LDL should go to the doctor. And then the top 1% varies between the top 1% of which population. Is so that doesn't matter. So
Michelle and I love that you throw it back to the clinicians and say, how is this clinically relevant? Because, what does one do with a high polygenic risk score? We can say, okay, you'll exercise more, you should eat less hot dogs and barbecue less. But does that mean, number one, as you pointed out, there's a 92% chance nothing will happen with this high risk? And number two, does that mean that I tell the low polygenic risk score people to not exercise and not, so
that doesn't work. But we don't. So I think most people now agree that we don't look at polygenic risk scores on their own. We combine them with clinical risk factors, etc. But you always have to look at what are we going to do with it. We should come to a point that we think, we've played already with polygenic risk scores for 15 years. This is already the 3rd time that they are really very, very popular. And so I think we should soon get over that area under the curve is what we gets us in the better journals. We really need to move forward to clinical utility, and then also start in a conversation with the doctors. If you, as a cardiologist, which of your decisions are you now making based on too much uncertainty? Which of your decisions do you want to be supported by better predictive tools? And start there, and start from utility, but not. I think we've done enough polygenic risk scores now. Just in the UK Biobank, you can run them for every disease and every subpopulation, and it doesn't tell us anything. And that's what I find so unfortunate.
I mean, our problem is that there's 40-year-old people who run marathons that drop dead of a heart attack. The issue is, I think
that's not because of a polygenic risk score.
Right. But the issue is, we're trying to make it not so stochastic, meaning there's a group of people, that think this is stochastic, that this is a random bad event that, that you would never be able to predict. But then there's a group of people that obviously would like to figure out, is there some causal thing that we could do different? Is that a fool's mission, do you think?
Well, little. Depends on how many. So I think it really depends. It's a fool's mission when you really have no clue for bigger risk factors, because when you make a prediction model, for example, like the Framingham Heart model, what kind of risk factors are in there? That are the common risk factors, because you only end up with statistically significant risk factors in your model. All the rare risk factors, don't end up there.
Right.
And so risk models are by definition for the big picture. And it is the the individual variation that goes beyond the common risk factors. It's very, very hard to model, if not impossible. Because with risk model, so that's then the model gets, you have to get all these strange interactions that never ever become statistically significant. So it never will be selected in a risk model. That's one problem. You cannot model it. But then on the other hand, to predict it, you need to know all the information that in your individual case will determine whether you drop down. Let's say drop down on during a run when you are 40. So you do not know which data you need to collect. So it is a problem with the modeling and with the data. And so I think when it comes to clinical relevance, I think there's still a lot of room for improving predictions. I'm optimistic in that, but it will be for those diseases where we have some or preferably multiple risk factors that have some impact on the disease risk, not all these tiny variants.
Yeah. So you would say something like breast cancer. You're saying something like where BRCA affects clinical decisions in a real way, because there's a causal mechanism, or I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess.
but also diabetes. Where obesity is a very strong risk factor, and I'm sure that will. Yeah. So it does not need to be all or nothing, or close to nothing and close to all. But like the Framingham risk score, where you can do some stratification, maybe not perfect. I think that there is room for improvement. I expect that with more measurements. I'm very curious what comes out of the microbiome, because I'm very, with new measurements.
What is the microbiome? Sorry.
The microbiome is all the bacteria in your gut, and how they play a role in maybe becoming obese, maybe all the metabolic diseases. I think new ways of getting closer to risk factors, also with the brain imaging. We may find better predictors for Alzheimer's disease when we look at with novel risk factors. But I think, looking at these million SNPs in your DNA, mostly having such a tiny effect. And that's also what coming back to the study of Kira et al. If you looked in the supplementary files, that most of their risk models that had millions of variants performed worse than the ones that has statistically significant variants only. It is just, you need to, in order to improve prediction, you need to have risk factors that have some impact on the disease risk.
Right. So this is a problem with big data, right? The problem with big data is that you just get, if you have a heart attack on a Tuesday, your mortality is lower. But who cares? Because that's not necessarily.
It is, with big data. So when you have a large data set and a lot of computer power, you can calculate everything.
Yeah.
But it's so tempting to forget the thinking. What are you calculating? And that is what I think we will do this for a while. These polygenic risk scores, until we all get tired of it, and then we start thinking, okay, doctor, what do you need?
Well, I think what's going to happen, and what's already happened, right? 23andMe and Ancestry. They've sold. There's so much money that's pouring in from direct to consumer buying, and because people are selling. It's essentially today's version of the snake oil salesman. They're selling, and they can't be falsified, because they're saying, well, you have a X% risk of getting Alzheimer's, and if you develop it, it's like, well, we told you so. If you don't develop it, it's like, well,
it's a chance. As long as you don't predict 0 and 100%, you're safe.
Yeah, Michelle, we need to get into this. We
That's
definitely
right.
need to start selling this.
Yeah, or put me on the advisory board, because I'm very.
Dr. Janssen.
Right, I know, but
we'll cut you in, Dr. Janssens. We'll give you 10% to say certified by Dr. Janssens, epidemiologist at Emory.
I take that.
But I think, I go back to what you were saying earlier, Dr. Janssen, is, prediction is about the group. It's never about the individual. And therefore, it cannot be a clinical tool, so long as the clinical tool is concerned with the individual. If it's right, just for the reason that Denise just said, if you're going to use prediction in the clinical arena, you can never be wrong, right? You can always say, I told you had a 50% chance of this, you must be in the other 50% if you didn't get it, and so forth. So,
but it needs to oh, sorry, go ahead. It needs to be informed by something that's real, is what Dr. Janssen is saying. So something with some pathogenic, LDL, BRCA, there's things.
It needs to make sense.
Obesity, diabetes.
Several years ago, I was on a symposium about big data analytics, and there was someone from Microsoft, and he was just talking about how they approach all this big data analytics and artificial intelligence and everything. And he was saying that they don't trust models if they don't understand why the model predicts. So it needs to make, at the end of the day, it also needs to make sense, especially when you use it for a major decision, a major surgical decision.
Correct.
Or, you can't say, well, we have here a tool. We do not know exactly why it predicts, but it gives you really high, really almost 80% probability of getting this disease. We do not understand the tool, but I would recommend prophylactic surgery. That doesn't work.
Correct. But then do you actually need, I'll tell you this, I never never ever in my clinical work pull out my Framingham risk calculator.
Okay.
Okay, I never
Is that a good thing?
Well, I don't know if it's good or bad, but I can tell you what I do. And then
Yeah.
I wonder if we never had the Framingham study, I don't think, we would be a lot worse off in terms of how we treat coronary disease. I think the course of coronary disease would probably be exactly the same. That there are things we understand, things we don't understand,
Yeah.
and whether we compute somebody, we say, oh, make a decision on the basis of the Framingham risk score that says that a person has a 12.6% risk, and therefore I'm going to start a statin. I find that completely ridiculous.
But you are internally, Michel. I mean, you're making a decision based on your experience for a 65-year-old who smokes, who's obese, who's a diabetic. That person. So I mean, Framingham is basically trying to objectify.
That's not glean, right? But I don't need the objectification. I don't need the quantification. That's what I'm saying. I don't need the statistical quantification. I don't need. I just need to get a sense, and so I make a judgment, and perhaps actually in two people who have the same characteristics, I may treat them each one differently because, again, each one is an individual and they may have personal circumstances that influence my decision one way or another, right?
Or their decision.
So the quantification, actually, I couldn't care less. I'm gonna, at the end of the day, I'm gonna make a decision, and I will never know if I'm right or wrong, right? I will never know if I'm right or wrong because, if I make a decision to do X and the patient does well, is it because I did X, or is it because he would do well no matter what?
Yeah.
Right, and vice versa.
But also, we should also keep in mind that the cardiologists are not the only one interested in the polygenic risk scores. Also, the for diabetes and obesity and cancer.
Yeah, but again, when you say
a lot of polygenic risk scores, and then they have an increased risk for heart disease, and the cardiologist says you should lose weight, but then for obesity risk they have a decreased risk. So why should they lose weight? So it is at the end it will be very, very difficult. I did my to confess at the end, I'm a health psychologist by training. And I did my PhD on risk perception, not on risk prediction. So I moved my career from risk perception to prediction. Risk perception, so how people deal with risks, that's a whole other ballgame, And
that's
therefore,
exactly right.
having whether when you showed me that graph that for some people the risk of coronary artery disease is not 3%, but it's 6% or 7%. For people, that is still a very, very high risk of not getting it. And if you don't want to change your behavior, you're not going to do it.
And it's very relevant clinically, risk perception,
Absolutely.
right? The risk perception of the patient is extremely important clinically, and it can override everything else that we try to predict objectively.
Even very frustrating, but it can, yeah.
And I hear what you're saying, that, the clinician, and I would say the academic clinicians, the community of academic clinicians are demanding, these objective risk prediction models. But I think that's to me, that's a little, it's a misplaced emphasis.
They're trying to limit variation, Michel.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's just, that's right. They're trying to limit variation. They're trying to make everything mechanical and predictable.
Yeah.
For the sake of
and
policy.
At the same time, put it in hands and put the responsibility to someone else, because if you don't understand how the polygenic risk is calculated, what science is behind it, what are you relying on? I don't.
Yeah, you're relying on the mystery of clinical judgments.
Yeah. No. Yeah, right. But what? Yeah, right. But no, Dr. Janssens' points here. Dr. Janssens is clearly. We need more voices like this. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much for now we've taken on more than an hour of your time on a Saturday afternoon. Yeah. Thank you so much. It was just really fantastic. So I hope we didn't make too much of a mess of it.
No. It was very informative, and I really enjoy conversations with doctors who want to do the best for their patients and not just do the most technology.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay.
Take care. All righty. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.